go live. So we are now live, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining in this event from pretty much around the world. I'm Maurizio Sabini, professor of architecture at Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, US, and author of the book, obviously, that we are going to discuss today, hopefully with the topics that will be coming out of the book for obviously a larger conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll have a round of comments, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So everybody in the audience joining us, please post the questions on the chat in YouTube, and then those questions will be forwarded to the panel, which is an exciting panel. I'm very excited to have all these friends and colleagues joining in. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I'll introduce in the order of presentations, and I will start with Janina Gosseye. She's an associate professor of urban architecture in the Department of Architecture at TU-Delft in the Netherlands. She has taught previously the University of Queensland in Australia, and from 2018 to 2020, Janina worked also at the ETH in Zurich with Tom Avermaete. Her research is situated at the nexus of 20th century architecture and urban history and social and political history. Janina has published and lectured extensively and internationally. Among her most recent books is Speaking of Buildings, Oral History in Architectural Research, published in 2019 with Naomi Stead and Deborah van der Plaat. She's currently the co-editor of the Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture, the book series in which my book has been published. Tom Avermaete is a professor for history and theory of urban design at the ETH-Zurich. But until 2012, he taught at the TU-Delft in the Netherlands as well. Tom has held several visiting professorships, amongst others, at the Polytechnic in Milan, at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and at the University of Copenhagen. Among his many books is to be mentioned Another Modern, the Post-War Architecture and Urbanism of Candelis, Josic and Woods, published in 2005, a firm that certainly was active at the time, and also in which Ernesto Rogers was. He's on the editorial board of OASE, Journal for Architecture, and previously of the Journal of Architecture Education until 2015. And he was also on the board of the Architecture in the Netherlands yearbook from 12 to 16. Tom is a member of the advisory board of several journals and think tanks, among which are Architectural Theory Review, the Docomomo Journal, and the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative. Tom is the other co-editor of the series Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture with Janina Gosseye. And then Eric Mumford. Eric is the Rebecca and John Voiles Professor of Architecture in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. He holds also courtesy appointments in the departments of art history and archaeology and history in the School of Arts and Sciences. And he's a faculty scholar also at the Institute for Public Health. Eric is an expert on the history of modern architecture and urbanism, and teaches courses in the history and theory of architecture. His many books include Designing the Modern City, Urbanism since 1850, published in 2018, books on Joseph Louis Sert, another figure of the second half of 20th century modern architecture, who closely collaborated with Ernesto Rogers. And the landmark book on the CIM Discourse on Urbanism, 1928-1960, which is a book that gives a comprehensive overview of the activities of that organization, the international congresses on modern architecture, in which Ernesto Rogers, of course, was very, very active. Roberta Marcaccio teaches at the Architectural Association in London. She's an educator, critic, editor, and a research and communications consultant. She has lectured widely internationally, and her articles have been featured in the AAA Files, Blueprint, Architecture Design, and the Zine. Roberta is a Grant Foundation grantee and has been awarded a Built Environment Research Fellowship by the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851, as well as a Research Publication Fellowship by the AA. Among her many publications is a recent book about alternative modes of architectural practice, such as this one here. I'm doing also some promotion of your books, colleagues. Architects After Architecture, published just last year, for which she received the Australian Institute of Architects Bates Smart Award for Architecture in Media. And that also is a book that ties into the topics of my book, as Ernesto Rogers really practiced and demonstrated an approach towards a practice in an expanded way, and really broaden up the field of professionalism for architects in an important way. But most importantly, Roberta is also working on a forthcoming book on Ernesto Rogers' writings, translated by Steve Piccolo, who has become in recent years a sort of the official architectural translator from Italian into English. A book with essays by John Ockman and Kurt Forster. So we are all looking forward very much to this forthcoming book by Roberta. And finally, Aaron Betsky is the director of the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech, a university with several locations across the state of Virginia on the US East Coast. Aaron has been from 15 to 20 president of the School of Architecture at Taliesin, the school founded by Frank Lloyd Wright. From 6 to 14 director of the Cincinnati Art Museum, and from 01 to 6 director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute in the Netherlands. And from 95 to 2001, he was the curator of architecture and design at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. He also worked in practice in the offices of Rangheri and Hotgets and Fang. He holds a weekly column on the Architect magazine. And in 2008, he also directed the 11th Venice International Biennale of Architecture on the theme Out There, Architecture Beyond Building, which again ties into the activities and the vision by Ernesto Rogers. Aaron is a critic and author of more than a dozen books on art, architecture, and design, among which are Falls Flat on Dutch Design Culture, a book that I always loved, and Architecture Matters, most recently, and especially this book also, Making It Modern, published in 2016, a book that similarly to mine, in a sense, in terms of approach, has the ambition of making an argument. In Aaron's case, I guess, an argument for the need of an architecture of modernity. In my case, is an argument of a particular way to approach the practice of architecture that Ernesto Rogers exemplified and modeled. I think we are done with I have a note from Aaron. Okay, just no longer director, just professor. Duly noted. Similar experience to mine, I must say. So, but yeah, so really excited to have all of you on the panel here. And without further ado, I will ask Janina and Tom to introduce the conversation by framing my book within their vision for this book series published by Bloomsbury Academic.
Okay, thank you, Maurizio. I think we would like to share the screen, so I hope that this works. Yeah, there we are. Well, good afternoon from Zurich to all of you, and I would say it's a pleasure to introduce the book of Maurizio Sabini within the bigger series Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture, which is indeed edited by Janina Gosseye and myself. And maybe just to start to say a few words on the point of departure of this series. And the point of departure for this series is that the modern movement was a broad and multifaceted phenomenon that revolutionized the field of architecture. Throughout the 20th century and across, we could say, political, cultural, and climatological divides, modern architecture and urban design radically changed the everyday lives of millions of people. And yet, in this series, we claim that to this day, our knowledge of this sweeping and omnipresent occurrence remains largely limited to the names of a few famed designers. In spite, we hold, of the growing research in the modern movement and its various actors, most published works continue to focus on a select list of mostly male grand masters. And this narrow view, in our opinion, restrains our understanding of what the modern movement in architecture was, as it limits our insights into the breadth and the complexity of the networks that underwrote it, and it undercuts also the possibility of what we would say a more holistic and fine-grained understanding of its impact on architectural culture and on the built environment. And this particular Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture, this book series, seeks to address this dirt. It attempts to create what we would say is a more fine-grained history of the modern movement, while broadening also both its geographical and its cultural scope. This series also wants to shed light on those who played pivotal roles in propelling the modern movement in architecture, but who have, nonetheless, languished in the shadows of their better known and extensively published, we should say, canonical peers. So examining the works and the ideas of what we call the shadow canon, this book series does not aspire to canonize those to whom it offers a platform, but rather to construct a more detailed understanding of the different actors that propelled the modern movement across the globe, as well as of the relationships that existed between these different actors and the ways in which they contributed to what we can call a transculturation of modern architecture.
So far, 4 books have appeared in the Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture book series, and each of these foregrounds a figure who was active in the modern movement, but who has, for various reasons, not been given great attention yet in architectural historiography. Sybil Moholy-Nagy, the protagonist of the first book to appear in this series, was an architectural critic, historian, and educator, and as such, she was part of what is commonly considered this auxiliary group of professionals who support the real work of architecture, which is done by architecture, and which contrary to the work of these auxiliary professionals, does get written up more frequently in architectural historiographies. But Being part of these auxiliary classes is likely not the only reason why Moholy-Nagy has been marginalized for such a long time. As Hilde Heine points out in this book, Moholy-Nagy's lack of a formal architectural training, her gender, her sharp tongue, and her love for controversy certainly did not help either. I'm not going to say anything yet about the second book in this series. We will return to Maurizio's work on Rogers in a moment, but I would like to say a few words about the other two books that have already appeared. The reason why the Danish architect Kai Fisker has lingered in the shadow of his more renowned peers, such as Arne Jacobsen and Jørgen Utzon, likely has to do with the complex position that he adopted vis-à-vis the modern movement. So, in this book, Martin Søberg argues that Fisker's shadowy presence may have been caused by his ambitious stance towards the ideas put forward by Siam. So in his work, Fisker sought for an alternative to the antithetical position towards tradition that Siam maintained. And instead, he assumed a more nuanced and balanced relationship between modernity on the one hand and tradition on the other. And then finally, there is the book on Karl Langer, an Austrian architect who worked in the Viennese office of Peter Behrens before fleeing in 1939 to Australia, where he spent the rest of his life. And this book by Deborah van der Plaat and John MacArthur sheds light on the work of Langer in the Australian tropics, and it thus raises questions about the transcultural character of the modern movement, because as we all know, Langer's trajectory is not that exceptional. During the 1930s, many progressive designers left Europe to live and work in contexts that were not their own, and the multitude of cross-cultural encounters that this European diaspora created profoundly affected the definitions, tools, and methods of modern architectural design. So this book on Karl Langer raises awareness about the limited knowledge that we still hold of many such migrant architects and points to the need to explore in greater depth how their acculturation processes have influenced the modern movement as a whole. There are several more books forthcoming in this series. First up on the docket is Pagon, which was an alliance of young Siam-affiliated Norwegian architects. And then there is Ludwig Hilbersheimer, who's probably less of a shadowy figure than many of the others who have been mentioned so far. Now, needless to say, Tom and I are thrilled with the books that have already appeared in this series and those that are forthcoming, as they touch upon a very rich variety of themes. But we would like to use this opportunity to launch a call for books that focus on figures from other geographies beyond Europe, Australia, and the US. And we're particularly interested in the work of women who, as we all know, have for decades, centuries even, lingered in the shadow of their male counterparts. So we hope that this series will offer an opportunity to correct this gender imbalance that still persists today in architectural historiography.
The book that to go back to the center of our discussion of today, the book that we celebrate today is, of course, on Ernesto Nathan Rogers, a towering figure, we could say, in post-war Italian architecture. With his collaborative firm, BBPR, Rogers designed some of the most influential architectural projects of his time, including the Torre Velázquez, which you see on the screen. And through his editorship of both Domus and especially Casabella, Rogers also gathered and mentored a group of young Italian architects who would go on to carve out illustrious careers for themselves. Think of people like Carlo Aimonino, Giancarlo De Carlo, Vittorio Gregotti, and Aldo Rossi. Rogers was, as we all know, also a prominent figure internationally. From the mid-1930s, he became, for instance, actively involved in the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne de Siam. Yet, in spite of his prominence, both locally in Italy and internationally, and regardless of his contribution to both the production of architecture on the one hand and the shaping of the discourse of architecture on the other hand, today Rogers is less well known and certainly less well studied than many of his contemporaries. This oversight has most probably to do in part with the uneasy position that Rogers assumed in post-war architectural culture. Rogers, for instance, recognized the value of history to the post-war debate on modern architecture very early on, which earned him the scorn from some of his contemporaries. In 1959, in the 1959 issue of the Architectural Review, Rainer Banham, for instance, chastised Rogers' support through his editorship of Casabella for what Banham called neo-liberty, or the Italian retreat of modern architecture. Rogers' support for neo-liberty has led some scholars to qualify him as a proto-postmodernist. However, in his book, Maurizio Sabini challenges this assumption. Unpacking Rogers' particular conception of history and of memory in architecture, Sabini argues that Rogers' stance towards modern architecture should be understood as an expression of critical regionalism rather than as a form of proto-postmodernism. Sabini also emphasizes Rogers' vision for the role of the architect as a public intellectual, and he details Rogers' commitment to pursue a renewed path of professional and cultural research within modern architecture. In our opinion, this makes the book Ernesto Nathan Rogers, The Modern Architect as Public Intellectual, not only a first critical account of Rogers' life and legacy in the English idiom, but it also encourages architects to reassess the tools that they have at their disposals and the roles that they might assume within the profession. You're muted.
Sorry, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Janina and Tom. As I said, I always felt fortunate that we found your book series as the house for my book. I couldn't have found a more perfect context. And as you have outlined already now, with the vision of your series and your commentary on the book, which is also included in your forward, you have perfectly captured, I think, the core of my intentions for this book. But yeah, we'll go on and let now Eric give us his perspective.
Great, thank you, Maurizio, and it's a pleasure to be here and see people that I've seen in various contexts around the world over the last 20 years or so. And it's very exciting to see that SIAM is now something that is really becoming a subject of serious study beyond, as Tom was saying, a few well-known figures like Le Corbusier, into a much broader understanding of these international networks and the transformative effects that not only did they have in the past, but I think an event like this demonstrates still continue into the present, that it's an unusual aspect of architectural culture, that there are these conversations across regions, across different kinds of people around these shared concerns, which are becoming, if anything, I think even more pressing as the world population increases and environmental challenges become more and more pressing. So I won't speak at any length about Ernesto Rogers himself. You can read the book. I think it's a really welcome addition to the literature that many of us who have studied Italian SIAM have often been frustrated by the fact there aren't very many sources that are not in Italian. And even those are often primary sources, like Rogers' own book, Experience of Architecture, which most people aren't even aware of. And even his editorship of Casabella, not something that many students I find are familiar with. So it's really a great resource to have for teaching. I thought today all I would do is talk a little bit about SIAM and Rogers' role in that. It hardly needs to be explained, I think, to a group like this, but hopefully for a wider audience. The SIAM really begins earlier and has incredible importance for the whole change in architecture that occurs in the 1920s, the shift away from the elite preoccupations of architecture previously, the Beaux-Arts tradition, very much about expressing hierarchy, about architecture for and by and for elites, originally court societies, religious institutions, and then expanding into the bourgeoisie and a lot of colonial contexts in the 19th century. It's really, I think, quite significant the way that SIAM and related phenomena like the Bauhaus in the 1920s really successfully shift the basis of architecture to this idea of serving more people, really ideally everyone in some way. And that, I think, is a point that sometimes gets lost in internal debates around around various directions of modern architecture. One of the key aspects of Rogers' work, of course, was town planning, something that a lot of my own work is focused on, this whole question of urbanism, a term that itself starts to be used around 1910 in France, although with earlier roots in Cerda's work in Barcelona in the 1850s. And Rogers, I think, and many other architects, of course, in Europe, continuing those preoccupations and trying to adjust them to the changing social and technical considerations of the 1920s, particularly this focus on dwelling as the first function, the idea that housing, living in the city, extremely important for the organization of the urban environment. Rogers also, I think, quite interesting as a figure, as Maurizio's book makes clear, in someone in both design education and in influencing public opinion through his editorial activities, his many teaching and lecturing sort of assignments, that he was able to further the goals of modern architecture in the very complex political context, which, again, I won't try to trace in any detail between the 1920s and the 1940s, but I think we tend to take for granted some of the global outcomes of that whole period, in which Siam was a central element, also Le Corbusier's office, also the pedagogy of Walter Gropius and other Bauhaus figures, all of them really creating these networks that in some ways still exist, and that many aspects of those being explored now, fortunately, in a lot of different scholarly contexts. So all of that really just to kind of situate Rogers not only as someone concerned with the historic fabric of Italian cities, but also as someone closely connected to the whole development of Siam, although in some ways, like Sert, critical of certain aspects of it in the post-war period. And so all of that really just to kind of situate the book in some way, and also in looking a little bit at how things developed before Sert and Rogers begin to kind of take over Siam after the Second World War, at a point where the political dynamics had shifted, where the US and the UK, at that moment, the dominant sort of forces in urbanism, the US model, really not Siam. There's often a misunderstanding somehow that Le Corbusier had some direct and important impact on American urbanism at mid-century. In fact, his ideas usually filtered through a variety of other contexts, including things like the Futurama of Norman Bel Geddes, the public housing and middle-class housing of Robert Moses, all of them relatively remote, and sometimes in Moses's case, hostile, actually, to a lot of basic premises of Siam. And so that's, I think, a point that isn't necessarily emphasized enough, something that put Sert and Rogers, like many other Siam members, in a rather complex position after the end of the war, that they represented an international organization that was no longer so clearly politically defined as it had been in the 1920s. The whole model of the Soviet Union had shifted completely. And they were really, in a way, trying to reconstruct a global architectural discourse where they started to change some of the premises, although keeping many of the basic aspects of pre-war Siam. And of course, a lot of that having to do with this issue of the city, of the heart of the city, a pressing question during the Cold War, where fears of nuclear annihilation, which unfortunately seem to be returning, that this was actually a major issue. Should the city continue to be a dense kind of concentration of forms and businesses and housing, or should it instead be something decentralized, which was really very much advocated, for example, by a lot of American defense officials in the 1940s and 1950s, that cities were really better as decentralized patterns like Los Angeles, very low density, rather than the traditional organization of the city. Siam looked to some extent, and this again I think isn't maybe appreciated enough, to London, to British planning right after the war, this idea of concentric cities organized with green belts, and then beyond that, new towns. A lot of those ideas also influential in other parts of Europe in fairly complex ways, which remain in some cases really to be fully traced out. So that's really the context then of Rogers and Sert and Jacqueline Turret's focus on the heart of the city, the subject of Siam 8 in 1951, a topic that Sert was already deeply engaging in his work in Latin America, and was also also, of course, of great interest, as you can read in Maurizio's book, to Rogers. And so this whole idea of why cities were important, not only their contemporary potential that Le Corbusier and others were exploring at that time in mostly unbuilt projects, but also the historic fabric of the city and how should the city be approached by CM and by modern architects. And again, I won't try to summarize what's already in the book, but for me, this is one of the important aspects of understanding how, in some ways, the models that were out there in 1945 were continued, but also critiqued by CM and by Sert Rogers, Turret, and others active in CM at that point. Also, another key aspect, history coming into CM at this point, that unlike the pre-war sense of tabula rasa, a lot of interest in historic genealogies, much of which has continued in the field. Gideon, an important figure in that, Sert eventually bringing Gideon to Harvard, as he also brought Rogers to Harvard in 1954, as he was beginning to develop his focus there on urban design. In many ways, continuing various currents of mid-century thinking, which then becomes structured into this curriculum in urban design, in which Rogers had an important, although often I think under-acknowledged role, and this whole idea of urban context, in some ways countering the still relatively abstract urban models that Sert and Wiener were proposing for Latin America at the same time. So again, I won't go into a lot of detail about that whole context. I think it's important to understand in relation to Sert and Rogers' work at this point, and to this whole focus in post-war CM on what was briefly the heart of the city, but then begins to shift toward this concern about human habitats, much less clearly defined term that leads then to the breakup of CM in the early 50s. And of course, Rogers very much against a lot of the directions that become associated with Team 10, which nonetheless become the more influential mainstream of architectural thinking by the 1960s. And that also, I think, potentially very interesting studies could be made of looking at this kind of cross conversation, ultimately very kind of tragically hostile, but between Rogers and other members of Italian CM and the members of Team 10 in the 1950s, that both in a way shared a concern about trying to revise earlier CM ideas of planning in a way that is not really as different as it might have seemed to the participants at that time. So that's really all I think I need to say today. I mean, really just kind of emphasizing the importance of Rogers in CM, particularly in the post-war period, and as someone who, for some reason, perhaps because of Team 10 and also maybe because of linguistic barriers, his work not nearly as well known in the English-speaking architectural world as it should be, despite the fact that people like Charles Moore studied with Enrico Peressuti at Princeton in the 1950s, and then went on to really introduce ideas that we still strongly associate with postmodernism, but which also have some of the critical regional qualities, at least in some projects, that we can also associate with Rogers' work.
Thank you, Eric. Very interesting set of observations. Yeah, the importance of CIM for Rogers' work cannot be underscored enough. A close associate of Rogers at Casabella, Francesco Tentori, who worked with him for many years, as I mentioned in the book, you said that for Rogers, beyond practice, CIM was first before Casabella and the school, which he cared a lot about. But he really saw CM as this platform for promoting the mission of modern architecture, which, as you mentioned, was at its beginning, as Aaron has also elaborated on, the offering a vision for a new environment for the middle class, and it is so somehow ironic and sadly ironic that somehow The end of SIAM happened with at the same time as through a harsh criticism of his project in Milan, which was clearly misunderstood. And yeah, as misunderstood, there continues to be his legacy as a proto-postmodern. Even I saw Anthony Widler mentioning that in his brief review of the book on Architectural Record last December, missing that aspect of ongoing criticism, of practicing, pursuing this approach of ongoing criticality that was the foundation of the modern movement, of modernity itself, which Rogers saw as a sort of a progressive and alternate way to go beyond the obvious problems and issues in which the modern movement found itself at mid-century. But let's continue with more comments from Roberta Marcaccio. Roberta.
Thank you. Yes, so as Eric was saying earlier, like Rogers, he's a bit like forgotten. It's like a lot of his work seemed to have disappeared in the background, and a lot of the influence that he has had on a lot of other figures has also subsumed somehow. And my experience of that goes back to when I was a student at the Architectural Association, and I think at the time everyone seemed to be obsessed with the theories of Aldo Rossi, but they used to talk about it as if those theories had emerged in a vacuum. And having studied in Milan, like I was previously in Milan, like I remember speaking with my peers about Rogers, and no one would know about him or would be intrigued by this character. And this realization of there being a gap in the historiography of the modern movement led me to start this project of translation, which I'm currently working on, that Maurizio mentioned earlier. And because I've been working on this book, and I've been working on Rogers' texts, and I've been selecting the text and trying to find a way of arranging them so that they can be conveyed to an Anglo-Saxon audience, or an English-speaking audience. Like, I'm familiar with the difficulty of carrying that message across, not just across the languages, but also of rendering Rogers' particular persona, of making this character alive somehow. And therefore, like, one of the things that struck me about Maurizio's book is the structure of the book. So you have these 8 very precise chapters that he uses to capture, to weave in the life, the work, and the writings of Rogers, and without necessarily using any of his words, and always like using this chronological rhythm to it somehow. But the result in this structure is that, first of all, it makes the book and makes Rogers' work easy to read, because let's face it, his writings are, his way of thinking is elliptical and circular, and sometimes like you can get lost in it a little bit. But also Rogers' work, Rogers' texts are always contextual. He's always responding to someone, so you always have to give a lot of you always have to have a little bit of context in order to understand exactly who he's speaking to and what he's speaking about. And there are always a lot of layers to it somehow. So again, this structure makes this task of translating Rogers across cultures much easier. But also, the other thing is that it is a manifesto. So as Maurizio says in the book is about a way of being an architect, and this way of being an architect is embodied by Rogers' persona to his work and life. And these 8 points that he singles out are, things that you can use to build your own idea of practice if you are a practicing architect today. I also teach a course at the London School of Architecture, a course which is titled Critical Practice, and the students have to produce a manifesto. They have to reflect on, they're doing placement work, they have to reflect on the current work in practice, and through that figure out a new way of working. And I've directed them towards this book as a way of saying, this is how you set up these points. But it's also a manifesto, not just for practice, but also for living. It's like, this idea that you have to work on yourself if you want to produce good work, whether you are an architect, an intellectual, or an artist, or a different kind of practitioner. And I guess like another thing that these 8 points underscore to me is a bit Rogers' obsession with this idea of communicating, of his role as a mediator between different realities that sometimes were really at odds with each other. Like he himself was English, but also Italian, was Jewish, but also fascist, or sympathizing with fascism at some point of his life. It was a lot of things. Like he was someone who was trying to conciliate within himself, to reconcile within himself a lot of different realities. And at the same time, it was someone who was always reaching out to, again, try to what I would say, to be able to hold the paradox as a way of not use in a lazy way, not adopt labels, not go with preconceptions, but always find the third way. So experience firsthand reality and produce something that is new, that is valid for the specific circumstances that we're facing. And you can see this in really like all these points. So again, the idea of criticality is this idea of exercising, which is the criticality, as Maurizio knows, is my favorite chapter in the book. But is this idea of using the case-by-case method, which is itself is a paradox, right? So there can be a method and be case by case, but it's like always verifying firsthand what the issues are, whether it's a site, whether it is a new concept or whatnot. This idea of social engagement again. So again, this idea of criticality is like to ponder ideas which might be at odds with each other and find a way that concises to is this, and that is also a mix of both, which gives a third way. This idea of social engagement, which is this idea of being an intellectual who engages with the wider public, and which helps create a new culture, which was really important at the time of Reconstruction. It was not just about building something new, it was about remending the torn fabric of the cities, but also the culture within Europe that had been of a population that had been ravaged by the war, basically. This idea of teamwork, so mediating between different people within the team, whether it is the BBPR or like the editorial teams at the different magazines that he edited, whether it is other collaborators that he found along the way. This idea of cross-disciplinarity, so again, mediating between disciplines, very important in all his work and his magazines. Internationally, he's been mediating between different cultures, which unfortunately didn't work too well at the CM, and is also this failure of different cultures to dialogue that led to the end of this institution, given the acerbic debates that went on towards the end. This idea of, especially the thing I found interesting is this idea of mediating between masters. He, with a bit of what I would call typical British understatement, Rogers considered himself a man in the middle, someone, halfway, like in between the generation of the older masters of the modern movement, who were like 10 to 15 years older than him, and the generation below of the young Turks or the Smithsons, who were again 10 to 15 years older, younger than him. And he didn't consider himself a master so much, but someone who had to make the two very different generations dialogue. And that considered to be his task, which was not a particularly easy one. And again, a mediation between history, like how to make the present and the future dialogue with the immediate history and the remote one. And again, and then more broadly, this idea of mediating all of this, bringing all these ideas in a way that is understandable by the wider public. So not being a detached intellectual, but someone who's very engaged. And again, this idea of communication, so really having understood that the modern project was after all a project through which architecture could communicate, the function of communication, once we had liberated architecture from being load-bearing, for instance, if we think about the facade, or from a series of other issues, like the function of communication for Rogers had become the primary function. And therefore this idea of expanding the limits of communication of architecture beyond the building itself, and including all these other activities of editorship, of being a politician, being socially engaged, and teaching as part of his broad and multifaceted career, was pretty much part of this project. And I think, again, this idea of mediating, of using all these tools to mediate between all these different actors and different ideas, is what comes across clearly in the book. And as Maurizio was saying, has a lot of affinities with the book that I've been working on, that has been published at Architects After Architecture, because I really believe that the mediator, whether we call it the intellectual, the social, the public intellectual, or the mediator, but this figure who is not so much busy making forms and making buildings, which are needed and are there, but it's not the only occupation, but this figure who is busy mediating between different intelligence, different knowledges, different issues, and is able to reframe the problems, make them anew, is precisely what is needed today. And therefore, I think that the more work we have that emphasizes and tries to capture what is this figure of the architect, the more the better the new generation is well equipped to carry over this task. Thank you.
Sorry, muted. Thank you, Roberta, very much. I think you touched on many important points and underscored some of the main goals that I had with the book. And I'm glad you talked about this topic of communication and how communicating was so important to Rogers. And his engagement in CIM was also part of that. There is this, I will read only one quote today, promise, but that relates to this. And it's a brief comment that Rogers made during a radio program. Soon after the war, he lined up a series of colleagues for radio programs to talk about architecture to the wider public. He also later on, at the end of the 50s, when Italian television was about to start, he produced a series of TV programs, the first of which was a discussion that he conducted on the Unité by Le Corbusier. And in this radio speech that he had in 46, he says, it would be beautiful to invent a device opposite to this one that is in front of me, the radio, which instead of spreading out a voice in the world, would catch and gather all the dispersed voices. Every architect should have such a device in the office, to put the ear next to it, to catch the chattering of the world, your words. We want to create the city of man. Now, so this idea of reaching out, really, that was a very profound and very heartfelt in his vision, in spite of the fact that he, like his colleagues at the BBPR, might have been perceived sort of elitists, especially, you know, by the younger generation, the angry younger generation of the CM. But yeah, for Rogers, that was very very important. And on one point that you mentioned, I would like to also briefly comment that his early adherence to the fascist movement was happened, you know, and at this very young age, soon after the war, the graduation. With this notion that you know, fascism is a complex phenomenon, and try to speak to a variety of social classes and segments within society. And there was this idea of collectivism that I think fascinated the group, and the idea that there was now a new setup, social administrative setup for a collective approach towards especially urban planning. But he, differently from other Italian architects, had no qualms in admitting the mistake, admitting clearly and without any hesitation, and remained actually engaged in progressive movements, you know, the end of the war and soon after the war. And so this, I think, was part of his attitude of wanting to be a public intellectual, engaged with what was going on in society. You know, it's famous, one of his editorial for Domus soon after the war, 46, 47, is a letter to the president of the Italian Republic, you know, and to talk about, you know, how architecture matters, how art and architecture matters. To a president who was not yet already elected, no, but as a way to really engage in this democratic process, and believing in the strength of a democratic society. So with Architecture Matters, I'll let Aaron jump in.
Thank you. And I am not sure what more I will have to add, but perhaps I will act as a bit of a burr in the saddle here, because I am in many ways still a very old-fashioned Marxist, and also a modernist who probably would have sided with the curator of refrigerators, Rainer Banham, in his debate. But I also warned you, Maurizio, that I'm by no means an expert on Ernesto Rogers, though I note that we are seeing a very interesting resurgence of interest in this particular period in Italian architecture. And I would note that we have, this book comes out in a kind of triad with major new books on the work of Carlo Molino and the work of Carlo Ponti. And it would be interesting for someone to actually look at those three figures and some of the other figures who were all in their own way trying to navigate between tradition and modernity, between materiality and abstraction, between style and expression of structure, and between various social issues. So that context to me is something that still remains, at least for me, to be fully mined, and one that would interest me a great deal. I also did go back to the other major text on Ernesto Rogers' work, which is, of course, Luca Molinari's wonderful PhD thesis, which I think, Tom, you were actually the advisor on, and which is luckily readily available as a PDF for anyone who wants to look at it. And reading that text and also reading this wonderful new book brought me back to actually the point I was trying to make in my book on modernity and modernism that came out a few years ago, which was to postulate modernism in all its many and various guises as continual attempts of the middle class, which by very definition does not have a fixed place in the world, to make themselves at home in modernity. And certainly the work of Ernesto Rogers, I think, can very much be seen within that context. Molinari has pointed out, and you mentioned as well, that Rogers was part of a larger movement, a social movement that sought to align itself politically with a third way between the left-wing bloc led by the communists and to a certain extent the much smaller Socialist Party on the one hand, and the Christian Democratic bloc on the other side. The Liberal Party, which never really took off very, very much, certainly not in that period, was the political home, but also was the political reflection of the middle class that, starting in the 1950s, led the miracle of Italian economic revival. And I would note in that respect also Rogers' connection to Ivrea and to Olivetti, who, as I'm sure you all know, and there was a wonderful exhibition about this at the Venice Biennale several editions ago, was trying to find an architectural and urbanistic vision that would give shape to a middle-class reality. And I would also note that for me, at least, the most fascinating of the BBPR projects are those which try to figure out ways in which middle-class housing could be produced, or in which manners in which workers' housing could be made into middle-class housing. And I'm particularly interested in the INA project and also its history since it was designed, which is currently the subject of, I believe, several studies. But I can think of no better symbol of the whole notion of a middle class trying to make itself at home in the modern city than building a series of upper middle class apartments in a protruding bulwark on top of a very large scale evocation of a Sforza castle in the middle of Milan. And of course, that is the most well-known of all of Rogers' projects, the Torre Velasco, but having it then be supported by a trunk of offices that gave home to many of the members of the, or leaders in the resurgence that led to the Italian economic miracle. and sitting, of course, on top of a retail core that, again, a retail base that brought in many of the elements of this new consumer society. It's wonderfully symbolic also, to go back to Eric's point, in terms of its collapse of what were meant to be zoned and separated elements in the Siam city, now brought together into a mixed-use structure. And in that sense, of course, was also prototypical for many of the objects that came after. I have to say that I am a little puzzled by everyone's strong resistance to understanding Rogers in relationship to postmodernity, even though it seems to me there is a clear line through his collaborations with the then very young Gugotti and Sotsas, and then even Tafuri, and the younger generation that was trained by those architects, which very much were at the forefront of the European version of postmodernity, which certainly in its Italian variant thought that it was continuing the criticality of modernism, which again built on Team 10's move from the abstractions of Siam towards understanding the basic demands of architecture as coming out of an attempt to represent and communicate, back to that word, the needs of citizens within specific locations. The particular Italian recipe that was developed for this, the continua, that Roger famously put in good modernist type on top of the free-flowing type of the original Casa Bella, was one that sought to find within Italian history, but also within local building traditions and materialities, places that could be, and elements that could be elaborated with new structures, quite literally concrete structures, but also with new social structures and with new roles for the architect. I will not speculate any further because I am dangerously at the precipice of my own knowledge in this area, but I would give out the polemical conclusion that unfortunately, in my mind, Rogers' influence in that matter, not his work, but his influence, and especially that of his pupils, was actually rather negative on the future development of Italian architecture. Having spent 30 years now commiserating with local Italian architects trying to liberate themselves from the absolute straitjacket and reactionary approaches to architecture that Gugotti and his friends were able to lay on at both a policy and a design level, it is hard for me not to see that the attempt to create a liberal architecture in which the master architect would maneuver a position that would be friendly to those in power, not necessarily disruptive of the city, and yet find ways to express and make at home the new leaders of society, stymied a great deal of experimentation and a great deal of other possibilities that were then being explored at the same period. And I would then point finally to some of the contemporaries that were working in Milan and Turin and the other parts of northern Italy at that time, and their wonderful experiments that I am afraid are in some ways even less well known than those of Ernesto Rogers.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for your perspective and your polemic, which is obviously expected, but that's why we welcome this kind of conversations. This is the Rogers' role in facilitating that line of postmodernism or the lines of work by others like Gregotti, who did not certainly consider himself a postmodernist, is well understandable. He himself, I think Rogers himself, was surprised by the attacks that he received and the criticism that he received from Banham, who had a point. I mean, if you look at the projects that were featured in those years, Banham's criticism is valid. Rogers, though, never fully subscribed. I mean, he was the editor of the magazine, so obviously those projects were published with his approval. But he didn't see that as as an ideological endorsement of those projects. He made a mistake, and I think if you read closely his writings, a mistake that he himself acknowledged in not seeing the potential outcomes and not distancing or presenting those distancing himself and not presenting those projects with the necessary critical framework. But he never endorsed certain lines of work. And so postmodernism was certainly an outcome that came out also of Rogers' work and the BBPR's work. But it was really never meant an intentional development or a desire, even let alone a desirable development. That happens, when you put forth work, ideas, and build work that things take a direction and a development that you did not expect. And so I think that more importantly than those stylistic developments is the message of criticality, which not by chance is the first chapter in the book, like Roberta mentioned, because that was really the foundation of how he saw the legacy of modernism and the legacy of modern architecture and the true meaning of modernity itself. He was also very in close contact with his friend, philosopher Enzo Paci, and the line of phenomenology that Paci was pursuing, and this idea of a dialectic that was obviously coming to Rogers from philosophy, and this constant questioning of results, of achievements, of ideas in an endless process. And so, what he experimented through projects like the Velasquez Tower, and later on, and in other projects, especially on the topic of relationship with history, was a way that he saw how modern architecture could develop. And his and I find his notion of pre-existing environments as a key, also together with his attention to the role of history and memory. And that's why, in my view, is more closely related to the idea of critical regionalism which did not yet exist at the time, but it's in a sense somehow to me could be considered an even a desirable development that Rogers could not see, but that he could have certainly subscribed to and endorsed. But I want to remind that, do we have any question from the audience? Helen Trice that you see here, but by the way, is helping us with the, no, we don't have any question.
I just had one thing to what you just said. I thought what Aaron said earlier about this idea of the straitjacket, which still very much binds architectural culture in Italy, I think is quite an interesting observation, and tracing back the roots to that, to a certain way of working that Rogers has embodied. Again, I think Rogers, like going back to this idea of criticality, he was critical first of all of himself, and this sense of failure of having set an idea of achieving something, embodying a certain type of figure, and having not quite managed to achieve his goal is something that is present throughout his writings, certainly. And yeah, it's like again, it's there, and it's very much the fact that to operate at his level, like at a very high level of teaching, of being an architect, of publishing, etc. It's like it's not really a democratic way of work. It's not like everyone can do that. I mean, even if you think about the Torre Velasca, it's not a project that everyone could have pulled off. It's like you needed to be seriously embedded in the culture, in the politics of the city of Milan, in order to be able to produce a project like that. It's like it went against the idea of planning permissions at the time. So again, it wasn't. I think that you point to something which is quite right. It wasn't a democratic way of operating. It's not like any other practice could have done that. That was a very specific, very particular way of practice, and only a circle, like a very narrow circle of people could tap into that way of doing architecture, of being an intellectual. But nonetheless, something to aspire to.
Thank you, Roberta. Any other comment?
Maurizio, maybe I may also ask an extra question, because to me, I mean, thinking about the reaction of Banham to the publications of Rogers as well, I was wondering, and that's maybe more a question to you, Maurizio, in how far you look upon the work, the publication work of Rogers, but maybe by extension also his design work, as something that has to do with a more explorative attitude, an attitude where it's not about, let's say, representing or championing as a certain approach, but exploring. Indeed, maybe in the Paci sense, a sort of dialectic of the modern and the historical, of the abstract and the material. So as Aaron was saying, so I'm wondering in how far, and this has to do for me also with this criticality, or even with a sort of reflexivity, I would say, understanding modernism or the modern movement as something that is reflexive as well, that can reflect upon its own tenets, as it were. I'm wondering in how far that was part of Rogers' approach, let's say, and induced indeed a sort of misunderstanding, pushing him in one camp and not understanding its more explorative attitude. I wonder if you wanted to comment on that.
Certainly, it was an approach towards architecture and reflecting on architecture and on theory that was explorative in nature. Remember, his only book is called Experience of Architecture, right? a book that is basically a collection of writings, that editorials and writings published previously in various occasions, with one only new essay attached at the opening, which is about the profession of the architect. Well, il mestiere in Italian is not quite the profession. I know Roberta can help me out here, but it's about the craft, the art and craft of being an architect. And so it is about this ongoing exploration, which was also a result of self-criticality, like Roberta mentioned.
Maybe also a provocation, if I can add. I don't know. I feel like a lot of his work would be, and I used to say to his students something like, one has to have architecture in his guts, right? Which, if you think in the context of functionalism, it was quite a provocation at the time. But, I wanted to some extent, like, the Torre Velasca is like, stretches the boundaries of what you can do with a facade before it becomes the pure historicism. And it's like this idea of provoking a reaction so that the conversation can keep going. So to some extent, it's exploring with new texture, with materials, but it's always to say, look, the modern movement was not about the way in which the building looks. It's about a program. And in order to, it's about a program, it's about a way of thinking about architecture, it's about all these things. And therefore, I provoke you to think about this by stressing the possibilities of communication of architecture on the facade. Therefore, I can make this evident somehow. Sorry, I interrupted you, Maurizio.
Right. No. That's good, Roberta. But if you think also how he departed from a clear difference of opinions from Gropius, whom he regarded as the most revered master and the most influential figure, and certainly the closest to him in terms of the architect as a public intellectual. But he clearly departed from Gropius on the role of history also in education. And for him, it was again also he said it several times that now at that point, the mid-century architecture modern movement had to move forward the certain positions that were necessary at the beginning, early modernity, lost their raison d'être, the rationale at that point. And architecture had to reappraise the value of history. And as I said, this notion of history is the one that is mostly attached to Rogers as a legacy. But I underscore, equally important for him was this idea of pre-existing environment and how architecture had to, and he demonstrated through his work and the BPPR work, how had to relate to the culture of the place and the character, the ethos of the place. And so that's why I think it was an ongoing exploration that he was advocating for. We have one question. Joe Bogowith is asking, Roberta touched on this. I'm interested to learn more about Rogers and how this conceptual paradox presented itself within his work and how he dealt with that. Not sure what conceptual paradox. is referring to.
I think I did say something along the lines of holding the paradox, and this is manifested in a lot of his work. So, it's like I take, I don't know, the Velasca Tower. So it's a tower, but it's also a house, or it's also a skyscraper. So it's like it blends in different concepts together within a building. Or in a lot of his essays, you would have titles like The Utopia of Reality, or this idea of bringing together different concepts, which apparently are completely at odds with each other. But he manages to resolve them in a way that it finds a third way. And this is very much to do, as I was saying earlier, with his own history. Like he was a bit of an outcast. He was of British origins and born in Trieste, and he desperately wanted to fit in within Italian culture. So he had to find a third way of fitting in somehow. He has to find a way of blending these two cultures into something that was new for the time somehow. And again, it's like you could go on and I think find a lot of these paradoxes within his personality and career. And also it goes down to the fact that he was homosexual, but he wouldn't have reconciled, wouldn't have talked about this openly. So there was a lot in his life also that he had to reconcile. And I think I would say the reason why I brought that up is because I think a lot of the freshness and a lot of the force of his work that comes up in his reading, in his writings, and in the way in which he talks about his project comes exactly from this effort of continuing trying to not resolve this paradox, but keeping it alive. So again, finding a third way that doesn't say one position is wrong, one position is right, but finding a new creative way in between these two, which, as I was trying to say earlier, it's like at a time when we're hugely polarized and it's like we're always like us against them, etc. I think is a very valuable lesson to learn. Maurizio, earlier you mentioned that beautiful quote from Rogers as he was speaking at the radio, and I think maybe he would have been like that the tool that he was envisaging is probably Twitter, if not AI, and he would probably have been horrified by some of those methods. But yeah, that's where the paradox lies for me.
Thank you. We also have a thank you from Lucia Krasovets about the conversation. Thank you, Lucia.
Maurizio, if I may ask a question of a different ilk, maybe a completely different ilk, and this maybe has to do with a personal fascination of mine. Could you reflect a bit on the writing process? Because I have a fascination with people who write biographies, and you have to sort of live with this person. And I notice that often there's a sort of tendency where people start venerating the person they write about. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how it was for you living with Rogers and sort of getting to know him and this writing process.
Oh, thank you, Janina. That's a very interesting question. I obviously, I met and studied under some of his followers, some of, Aimonino, Rossi, De Carlo. So I had that indirect, Semerani, Luciano Semerani, that indirect knowledge. And I learned a lot from them, but I also wanted to delve deeply into obviously the original work and his writing. And I must say that, I did my PhD dissertation on memory in architecture. And of course, Rogers was part of it. But at that time, for whatever reasons, didn't study deeply as a focus of study on that. And so it remained always in the back of my mind. But now with this book, having to delve more deeply into his writing, especially, it was a revelation for me, because again, you find that after having studied this, you find an incredible richness of thought about architecture, incredibly contemporary also. Think about that. Rogers never wrote, as I said, his only book is a collection of essays. And then there's one other book that was even published later about editorials. He had the one little book that he wrote, which was on for the sake of selection, a contest within academia to get, to become a chair at the Polytechnic, which arrived very late in life. A book that he himself was not happy with, and he asked the publisher to withdraw the book from the market. That goes back, it ties back to this idea of criticality, like Roberta was saying, this self-criticality, especially also. He was not happy with that book. And he was right, it's not a good book. But his best is in these, circular, labyrinthine reflections and brief moments of writing and reflecting on architecture, which could be the editorial, could be a speech at a conference, could be even a speech at the Rotary Club in Trieste, where where he loved to return often, as an ongoing conversation, an ongoing reflection. That again was the true testament to his idea of criticality. And for me, I must say that I cannot say that now I'm venerating Rogers, but like you said, when you write a biography, this was not quite a biography, but it was like looking at his overall body of work and theories and writings. And I still have my some critical considerations here and there, but in the process, I came to I see that Aaron has to go. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you very much. I see that his body of theoretical work and reflection is so rich, so deep, and so articulated that can remain a source of inspiration for generations to come. Again, I'm not venerating him, also because I didn't have the chance to meet him personally, maybe. So I have that distance, I think, that allowed me to pursue a critical review of his work. But the consideration of his legacy greatly increased in the process of doing this book. Yeah. Okay, I guess that we ran 1 hour and a half. So I don't know if there are any other comments from.
I would just say, I think it's a great contribution to the literature, and I really welcome this whole series. I think it's a great effort, and I very appreciate, I know the amount of work that goes into producing books of this kind, and so I think it's a great thing, and happy to be part of it. The other thought I had is just historically looking at this period of Ernesto Rogers. I think British and American kind of encounter with Europe is really maybe more important than we tend to just assume as global discourse, but actually, certainly looking at architecture today, there are very significant differences, and that a lot of the European approach that Rogers is a significant figure in advancing is still not really even well understood in the American context. I'm sure Maurizio knows this quite well. And so, so I think that it's important that people get a sense of the thinking that led, whatever its limitations, which Aaron Betsky referred to, the thinking that led to then this revaluing of the city in the period after World War II, this whole atmosphere of reconstruction and really trying to reconstruct culture, I think, as Roberta mentioned, as well as the physical form of the city. And that those seem like extremely important issues, which are not irrelevant really to the American situation, even though our frameworks still tend to be formed by this kind of postmodernist and, you know, to some extent, Rainer Banham's book on Los Angeles, and, you know, this idea of kind of free market environment of the metro region or something, in which the historic artifacts of the city are mainly only seen as something that can be commodified. So anyway, I think it's a really great contribution to that whole discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you, Eric. Thank you. Yes, again, I totally agree that this series that Janina and Tom put together is super important, super welcome, and really will offer great opportunities to ongoing studies on modern architecture for the younger generations to whom we are speaking to. Okay, well, thank you again, everybody. This was really a great conversation, exciting, and looking forward to more of this in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurizio.
Bye.
Thank you, Maurizio. Bye-bye.